In too many cases, in the seasonal sector, there are people who work, who go and claim EI, and then the employer needs to go find other people, and often ends up bringing in temporary foreign workers to fill those jobs.
That's a Human Resources Minister, Diane Finley, on the program just a minute ago, defending these new rules out for out-of-work Canadians applying for employment insurance. The big question here with these reforms, will they help fill labor shortages, as the minister argues, or make it more difficult for some employers to hire the people they need? Do the changes take into account the proper regional differences, say, between Alberta and Prince Edward Island, the nature of seasonal work across the country? Lots of debate about this. Let's get some reaction from MPs. Kelly Leitch is the Parliamentary Secretary to Diane Finley, Human Resources Minister. Also in Toronto, Peggy Nash, the NDP Finance Critic, and Scott Bryson is the Liberal Finance Critic. He is in Halifax. Let me start with Peggy Nash. We just heard, and you listened to the minister. What's your reaction to these changes? She's arguing essentially that these new categories for workers essentially will make sure Canadians fill the jobs before foreign workers.
Well, I mean, those are the rules now for temporary foreign workers. And when the minister talks about the longer people are on unemployment, the further afield they have to look in terms of the kinds of jobs they're looking for, that's already in the law today. What is confusing about the minister's announcement, it's as though somehow unemployed workers aren't quite smart enough, or maybe they're too lazy in order to get themselves into available jobs. I don't buy it. We have 6 unemployed workers in Canada for every available job. And I've spoken to a lot of people as I've traveled across the country who are desperately trying to get into jobs. There are lots of barriers around training, around entry qualifications. We shouldn't be squandering the skills that people have now. We should be adding to those skills, helping people retrain to get into jobs that are available. But make no mistake, we have a high unemployment situation in Canada because our economy is flat. And we have almost 15% of young people unemployed. That's a serious problem. There's been about $13 billion in corporate tax giveaways just for this year. But I don't hear any pressure on employers to say, hey, folks, step up. Let's create some more opportunities. Let's invest now so that Canadians can find jobs.
So let me, Scott Bryson, I want your reaction to one element of this is the government will be requiring local employers to try and hire Canadian workers before they hire temporary foreign workers. Now, I understand, as Peggy Nash said, that was part of the old legislation, but look at the situation in New Brunswick. You've got 210 temporary foreign workers were hired to work in a fish plant. I'm quoting some stats from StatsCan. But there are 2,400 fish plant workers collecting EI. So is the change to try to fix that worthwhile?
Well, I've been meeting with employers in Atlantic Canada, but also across Canada. In some cases, farmers, significant farmers operating large horticultural operations. In other cases, food processors and manufacturers. And they tell me that these changes could devastate their companies, which are already barely making it. And the reality is...
But why? Why will it devastate? I'm just trying to get a statement. You got 214 foreign workers, and you've got 2,400 fish plant workers collecting EI. So just what is the average Canadian when they're seeing that? What do they think?
The idea of a conservative government that believes business should operate their own businesses, telling businesses who to hire, is a little rich and frankly inconsistent with traditional conservative economic policy. Businesses are hiring foreign workers because foreign workers are part of the global supply chain. And if we take steps to impede their capacity to do that, we are going to hurt the competitiveness of Canadian companies. And frankly, there is a xenophobic overtone to the Conservatives' messaging, you know, Canadians first. It's like the old days when they used to have those horrible signs that said Irish need not apply. They're playing into a xenophobia and a prejudice against new Canadians and temporary foreign workers.
But is it logical when you've got over 700,000 unemployed workers that aren't even collecting EI, let alone those that are collecting EI? Don't you want to employ those before bringing in temporary foreign workers?
The reality is that there's a skills issue. the skills required in some of these companies and some of these farm operations. There is a seasonality. I mean, the Conservatives can try to get rid of seasonal workers, but they can't get rid of seasons, Evan. And whether you're in horticulture and farming or fisheries or forestry or in some areas of manufacturing and food processing, the reality is that a temporary foreign worker actually can create jobs for Canadians, and the way that happens is that at different levels of the value chain, the temporary foreign worker that helps pick apples, well, there's a value chain issue later on in terms of packing and transporting apples or making food with those apples. Those are Canadian workers, and what I've been told by farmers in my riding, and I've got a significant horticultural industry that are telling me that these changes could be devastating to them, is that they should recognize that, in fact, temporary foreign workers help strengthen their competitiveness. Right. None of these changes should be made without consultation with provinces and with actual businesses who will be affected.
Let me pick up on this consultation with Kelly Leitch, the consultation with the provinces that Scott Bryson's mentioning. Here's a statement we received from the Nova Scotia Premier Darrell Dexter, Kelly Leitch. He says, quote, "I'm disappointed that the federal government failed to consult with the provinces and territories on an issue that will impact workers and their families across the country. Under the new rules, some EI recipients that are eligible now become less eligible in the future. The changes will make it difficult for some employers to stay in business, including operators in the farming industry." I also have the PEI Premier, Mr. Giz, on the program later. He tells me he wasn't consulting, and he says this will hit his province hard. Why not consult the provinces first?
Well, actually, Evan, we went out and consulted with Canadians. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was throughout all of the Atlantic provinces. Next week, I will be in Western Canada as well, traveling with our Human Resources Committee. The government consulted widely with Canadians across the country, employers and employees.
But not the premiers.
Look, I think that it's important that Canadians and Canadian employers, both employees and employers, are the ones who are building this economy in this country. They're the people contributing to EI. They're the ones that are growing companies, both the employers and employees hand in glove. They're the people we consulted. They said they want a more fair system. That's what we're delivering.
But so does it punish seasonal workers? I mean, the reason I look at New Brunswick, and you hear from Darrell Dexter, and you hear from Premier Giz, because they believe that they'll be responsible for these seasonal workers. They say you've got to make exceptions. They're very different kind of economies. And you've got to make exceptions for those provinces, because it's not like people work, as Premier Giz says, in seasonal work in the fishery. It's not like they work 40-hour weeks during the fishery. They may work 75, 85 hours during that season. So it's very different kind of work. Will there be an exception for those provinces?
Well, you know, Evan, I have a riding where there's a lot of seasonal workers, both in the tourism industry as well as farmers. And they are all delighted with these changes. And the reason they're pleased with them is it has created a perception that now they will have Canadians locally that they'll be able to employ. They want to make sure they grow their businesses. They want to make sure they're employing Canadians. So these initiatives are making sure that we're connecting Canadians who want to work in a local area with a certain skill set with the jobs available to them in that area. We're actually investing $21 million over 2 years to make sure we're connecting Canadian employers with Canadians. In addition to that, a point that was made earlier is, what is the federal government doing on the training side? Well, we've made unprecedented investments in training, whether it be through labor market agreements, as the minister mentioned before, or in this most recent budget, an additional $60 million towards youth, in the youth employment strategy, to make sure young people have the skills they need to enter into the workforce.
Peggy, let me get Peggy Nash's view on that. I mean, you're listening to Kelly Leitch and you heard the minister on that. What's your view? Is there enough jobs retraining? And in your mind, just to pick up on that other point, do you think certain areas of the country, seasonal workers, for example, will get unduly punished by this?
Well, first of all, let me say in this Budget Implementation Act, there are 7 times as many measures that eliminate jobs as there are job creation measures. And part of the problem with these changes to EI is that they're folded up with fish allocations and changing CSIS oversight and so many other things in this budget bill when it ought to be, this ought to be a separate discussion throughout Canada, and it ought to go to the appropriate committee to be properly debated, because it's going to impact not only people who pay into EI. Let's remember it is an insurance program that Canadians pay into, but it's going to directly affect people who will be hurt by these changes. We just heard Kelly Leach say that there are people now who will, in essence, be forced into jobs in the farming
that is
sector.
So not true, Peggy. That is not
you just
what I said.
There are people
that
who are going to be available to work on those jobs who wouldn't. Excuse me, let me finish. People who wouldn't be working in those jobs earlier, who will be working in those jobs now. But let me also say, this government's making changes to the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, and I see it differently than Scott does. I think, as we've always done historically, people should be able to come to Canada and work and become landed immigrants and become citizens in Canada. That's how my family came. Whatever their skill range is. But with the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, the government's making changes now where they can be accepted more quickly. Within 2 weeks, employers can get temporary foreign workers instead of the months it took before, and they can be paid 15% less than the going wage.
Paid less.
It's exactly what the bill.
No, that's not.
Kelly. It's in the Budget Implementation Act.
15% less than the average wage.
It's in the Budget Implementation Act. It's before the Finance Committee now.
All right, I got about 20 seconds here, Mr. Bryson.
Well, look, the government's saying they're going to help unemployed Canadians. They're going to send out emails to them twice a day. 30% of Canadians don't have internet access. I mean, this is, and particularly low-income Canadians who are struggling. What on top of this, the government's getting rid of cap sites, which are the one way that low-income Canadians have access to internet. I mean, they're being very ham-handed with this. They're being very insensitive. I think this is a political calculation where they're looking where the votes are, and they're basically writing off a lot of parts of Canada, including Atlantic Canada. I think their Atlantic Canadian members are very frightened about what the electoral prospects will be in the next election. But I think this is also an attack on rural Canada, right across Canada. Kelly said that she's talking to employers in her riding. I'd like Kelly to have a public meeting with the agricultural leaders and the farmers in her riding and talk to them about these
Scott,
issues.
I did just that 3 weeks ago. I had 40 farmers at my home. We had a great discussion, and they are delighted with what this government is doing.
Well, maybe we'll have to have a chat with them as well, because I tell you, I don't think they would be very happy with the impacts on their industry.
All right,
and in fact, across Canada, we're hearing from horticultural leaders and from farm community leaders. This is going to be devastating. The government should not pursue this until they've sat down with the premiers and sat down with business leaders, people actually employing Canadians, to know what the impact is going to be.
I got lots of tweets on this. All of you, someone saying, Evelyn A. Smith saying, please ask about seasonal workers in education as well. There's lots of concerns here from people in seasonal work here. We'll talk more about this later.
Too,
Kelly Leach, Peggy Nash, Scott Bryson. A good discussion and one we'll continue having. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Evan.